All right. We're live now for the June 2025 AMA. That's Ask Me Anything session. Don't see any questions already lined up. So I'll just start by mentioning something cool that I've got coming up this month that some of you may be interested in. There's a link to it down below that you can see. And it is the 8-week online Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues class hosted in my Study with Sadler Academy. So if you're really interested in learning about Stoicism, this really key idea of the virtues, then maybe you want to take that class. We'll be meeting on Saturdays in the mornings, well, my mornings, depending on where you are time zone wise. And we'll be going through doing sort of deep dives into each of the 4 cardinal virtues. We'll actually be spending 2 weeks on one of them, justice. We'll spend some time ahead of that, like looking at the general conception of it, how it's different than, say, Aristotelian virtue ethics or Platonist virtue ethics. And then we'll finish by looking at some of the challenges to the Stoic conception of the virtues. So, yeah, that's one of the cool things we've got going on this month. I see a few people saying hi. If you got questions, that's what this whole thing is for. I set aside some time each month to answer and address questions. Some of them are very straightforward and simple. Some of them are a bit more complicated and require longer answers. And you, as the viewers, the people attending, get to ask away. It could be about philosophy, could be about other things that I'm doing, involved with, the city here that I live in, Milwaukee, music. A lot of people ask me about heavy metal things, speculative fiction, because, I do an entire series on that. So whatever you've got, go ahead and shoot it. So, all right, UDB says, how's it going? Still watching your videos up to this day. I'm studying philosophy in university now, and your videos have always been helpful. That's awesome to read. I get quite a few people providing those comments like that, saying finding the videos helpful while I'm studying. So that's one thing that they're designed for. I created them originally for my students, but they kind of help people out all over the place. Edmund says, in Discourses 1.1, Epictetus says only reason can judge itself, unlike grammar or music. Doesn't he just assume that makes reason special or divine? It feels like a jump, or is that just an axiom? So to answer the 2 last things, no, it's not just a jump, because you got to read Epictetus's stuff there in context of the other things that he says. Is it just an axiom? No, both of those are off base. So let's back up a little bit. When Epictetus talks about reason, he doesn't say the word reason. He says, hey, logike, the rational faculty, right? So it is a faculty of the human being. And guess what? In Epictetus, it's also the same thing as the ruling faculty, the hegemonikon. That's another name for it. And it's also either the same thing or pretty damn close to the faculty of choice, the proairesis, right? So all 3 of these are quite arguably either exactly the same thing, just looked at from different perspectives, or they are faculties that are so closely connected that there's almost no daylight between them. That's very, very different than other ways of looking at that sort of stuff from earlier philosophers or later philosophers who will say you've got a faculty of reason and a faculty of will, and they're 2 totally separate things. Not the case there in Epictetus if you read attentively. So the way that you'll figure this out and understand it better is by rereading that passage, but also situating it within the rest of the discourses. Because, and this is a great example of something that holds not just for Epictetus, but for a lot of philosophers in general. typically, if you only focus in on that one thing and you're like, yeah, I don't get how he gets this out of here. Well, the answer is somewhere else in the text, whether it's Descartes or Aristotle or, Seneca or whoever else. And he doesn't assume that makes reason special. He doesn't say it's divine there, by the way. He says that elsewhere in the text, that faculty is a little bit of God within us, but he's not assuming it. He's arguing it there for you. And notice what he's doing. He's using reason, the rational faculty, to argue about that. So he's demonstrating to you that reason doesn't just judge itself, it's reflexive in other ways. It orients itself, it explains itself, it understands itself. So, all right, Calypso. Who are some philosophers you haven't read much or at all, or haven't gone back to in a long time, that you would like to delve into if you had the time? When it comes to like people that I haven't read much or at all, that's probably less compelling for me because, if I don't know their work, I don't know what I'm missing, do I? Right? So that's a little bit harder to say. I guess you could be like, well, a lot of other people say that so-and-so is quite interesting or worth reading. But I haven't read them yet, so I better go check it out. I don't know too many people like that who I haven't gotten around to reading, where I'm like, oh yeah, I can tell there's definitely something there. Because I've been doing this now in one way or another, as a student or as a professor or, content producer, whatever. So since 1990, so we're talking about 35 years, a lot of time to read things. Now, haven't gone back to in a long time. That's a little bit different. That's a good question. So people who I know I really enjoyed and got something out of, but haven't had the time to read recently. So how recently are we talking about? I would say that there's some ancient thinkers who, well, for example, I haven't read Plotinus for a while, and I know that's, cool stuff to check out. Same thing with like Simplicius as well. I haven't read his stuff for quite a while. I haven't been doing much on Neoplatonism, or at least pagan Neoplatonism. It's been a while since I've gone to Lev Shestov's works other than his like comparative studies with Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Tolstoy, and his early works, All Things Are Possible. I haven't read Athens and Jerusalem for quite a long time, and that was a great book to read. So, maybe some of that. Somebody who I've been intending to get back to for a long time and haven't is Wittgenstein. He's got some really interesting stuff to say. I think those would be some good examples. Phenomena Librarian says, which living philosophy do you think will be read even 100 years from now? Well, so if you'd asked me that just a couple weeks ago, I could say Alistair McIntyre, but unfortunately the guy died at 96 years old back in May. And that's, it's a significant loss because he was still quite productive into his 90s. And I think that people are still going to be reading McIntyre. I think there's other great historians, people who take a kind of historical approach will still be read in 100 years from now. Julianus, for example, maybe my colleague Chris Gill, but like the big name philosophers of the present, let's actually talk like who's probably not going to be read. I don't think people are going to be reading Zizek 100 years from now and saying, "Oh my God, what a brilliant person." I think it'll be sort of like a Herbert Spencer. People will know about him, but they won't be reading him. Will Jürgen Habermas be read in 100 years? I don't know. I mean, discourse ethics is kind of interesting, but Habermas is not a fun read. So I think part of it is like, who do you actually enjoy reading? If they really make you work for little nuggets of interesting stuff, maybe it's not worth spending the time on them, and it won't be such a big draw. I mean, we read Augustine today, not just because he's influential, but because he's an interesting thinker and he's well worth checking out. The ideas remain pretty fresh. Even a lot of the metaphors remain fresh. We don't read Herbert Spencer or Auguste Comte anymore, at least unless we're like historians or something. Unless we're specializing in their work. I mean, it's kind of funny to see people like come back into vogue. So with the alt writers these days, people are now reading these obscure traditionalist thinkers like Joseph de Maistre. Nobody's been reading him for a long time, right? But they're finding some use for him. They should read Charles Maurras, the axiom français guy, because pretty much most of what people like Steve Bannon and Mencius Moldbug / Curtis Yarvin have to say is just warmed over Charles Maurras from the early 20th century. But I guess they don't know that, or maybe they're plagiarizing him. I don't know. So. All right. Lapse 9 continuum. When I hear people these days trying to justify ignorant or hurtful things, I sometimes feel a duty to make the counter argument. At what point do we decide it's not worth it? Well, I think there isn't a single guideline or rule of thumb for that, but I think that you can ask yourself, and you probably should ask yourself, where is this felt duty coming from? Is it something that you internalized from somewhere else? Is it part of what we might call the ideological apparatus of, the crazy bullshit of the marketplace of ideas that probably winds up screwing some of us up over time? Is it because you feel responsible for fighting off all the evil in the world, which is a pretty unrealistic point of view? So, you probably want to look into your own motivations about that. And I understand this motivation because I myself was pretty subject to it. You've all seen that meme or actually cartoon where a wife is like, "Come on, honey, come to bed." And he's in front of his computer and he's like, "I can't. Somebody is getting something wrong on the internet." And that guy's never going to get to bed because there's always somebody getting something wrong. By the way, that notion goes all the way back to Seneca's work on anger, where he talks about, is the wise person going to get angry with all of the injustices in the world? They're always going to be angry. They're always going to have something to focus on. So you don't need to necessarily make the counter argument. I mean, you could ask yourself some pragmatic questions. Who are you making this for? Are you making it for the person who's saying hurtful things? Will they actually listen to you? Or are they doing it because that's the kind of person that they are? Are you doing it for the audience so that maybe they can see that there's a different side to things? Are you doing it to help the victims? Are you doing it for yourself? Right? Those are all different, we could say, motivations. And so those might be worth thinking about. But it's a very interesting question. So, all right. A lot of stuff here posting from Aristotle. So I'm not going to read all of these because we do want to get to other people. Aristotle's so dense, there's a nugget in each word. That's wrong. No, and we don't need to place people up on these super high pedestals. As a matter of fact, That's a great way to misread people. But Plato is the best writer on 10 levels, also equally wrong. We know from ancient sources that Aristotle wrote dialogues that were just as good as Plato's. We just don't have them. So we should avoid making dogmatic, hyperbolic statements like that. Almotosum says, after reading McIntyre and Nietzsche, who do you choose? McIntyre, right? And McIntyre himself has good reasons for why we should probably not buy into all of Nietzsche. If you've read McIntyre, you know that, because he's got that chapter in After Virtue, Aristotle or Nietzsche, right? And he gives you some reasoning for that. Not to say that we should just throw Nietzsche away. He's got some really interesting criticisms of various things in modernity, but we also want to be critical about Nietzsche himself, right? And I think Nietzsche would want that. John Garrell, what do you think about Hegel's critique of classical logic? To me, it seems like he mixes up the logic with its application. I don't think that we can work at that. And I've said this many, many times before, at that sort of like level of generality and say much that's valuable. So mixing up classical logic with its application. Which classical logic? Are you talking about Aristotle? Are you talking about the many different kinds of logic that were floating around there from the Renaissance onward? Are you talking about other stuff going on in the 19th century? Which do you mean by classical logic? There is no such thing as classical logic. There's just things that we call classical logic locally. Hegel is definitely trying to do something that expands the boundaries, but leaves room for doing that kind of stuff when it's helpful. You should think of it less as like Hegel is opposing classical logic with his own logic, and more like his logic is supposed to be more comprehensive. And guess what? He's not the only one doing that. Leibniz did that in his own way. Maurice Blondel, coming, about 80 years after Hegel, is doing something similar. So is Croce, who's a Hegelian. So, I don't think it's very helpful to try to do that sort of like super, super high level of abstraction, thinking these things through. Vedant, reading nihilism, reading nihilism and hedonism, I've become negative in life. I imagine what you mean there is reading nihilistic authors and hedonistic authors, right? I'm young, find myself overthinking about what's the point? Everyone will die, my peers, family, how do I get out of this phase? Well, you ask yourself the question, so what? So what if they all die? What does that mean to you? Does that mean that you don't have anything good in the present? I mean, super easy to so I've got some stuff right here. I had to stop eating before I got on. I've got this little marinara sauce here and some breaded eggplant from dinner last night. We had some, good Italian food, and I was, munching on it before I got on, and it's tasty. It smells good. I'm looking forward to eating it after I get done with all of you and your questions. Is that nothing? It's not a big thing. And in the grand space of the universe, it doesn't mean a hell of a lot. That doesn't mean it's not good, right? I mean, focus on the little stuff. Again, in my previous answer, I was talking about like high level of abstraction. People screw themselves up by buying into isms like nihilism or hedonism without ever asking yourself the question, these authors that are telling me this stuff, how the hell would they know what they're talking about? They're generalizing about human life per se and the universe as a totality. Who made them God that they know all of this stuff? And why am I buying into their stuff? So I think that's, those are some lines that you could probably adopt that might be helpful for you. Let's see here. Tamja says, how can fresh graduates or young learners create his or her own deep understanding in philosophy? You don't need a deep understanding in philosophy if you're a fresh graduate or young learner. It's enough just to work at like an intermediate level. Instead of like trying to get from A all the way to Z, try to get to D. and you're gonna have a lot more success, and you'll build stuff that'll actually be useful for you. So, for example, if you want to study Aristotle, do you need to read every single book the guy wrote and just focus on that all the time? I mean, you definitely need to read and reread the Nicomachean Ethics, and if you're interested in ethics, probably the Eudemian Ethics as well, where it differs from the Nicomachean. And it couldn't hurt to read on virtues and vices in the Magna Moralia, even though they might not be Aristotle himself. And you also want to read the rhetoric and the politics and the poetics and parts of the topics, because they all have to do with ethics, broadly speaking. But do you need to go on and read the On the Heavens? I mean, it's nice to get to that sometime down the line, but you don't actually need that for thinking about ethics, do you? If you want to read the physics and metaphysics and think about the other ancient thinkers, that's cool, but you don't have to like understand every one of them on a deep level. That comes later on. And I think trying to set yourself a path to do that is actually, for a lot of people, counterproductive, and it leads to a certain kind of perfectionism that leads to despair. So I wouldn't suggest doing that. Gayen, here's a good question. How much of Nietzsche's hatred of Christianity is of Christianity proper, and how much comes from his hatred of Plato and his seeing Christianity as Platonism for the masses? Christianity as Platonism for the masses is just a slogan. It's not an analysis, and we shouldn't be using it to try to understand Nietzsche's thought, because his approach to both Plato and Socrates, by the way, is much more complex than just hatred. And his approach to Christianity is pretty complex as well. And this begins all the way early on in the birth of tragedy, where, for example, he actually praises Plato, doesn't he? If you've read that section where he talks about the Platonic dialogue as being a new genre of literature that is cobbled together out of the shipwreck of ancient tragedy, he's not just, hating on Plato at that point. He's actually saying something, I think, quite profound. So, I would avoid relying on those kinds of like throwaway slogans. Nietzsche has a beef with Christianity for a number of different reasons, and with Platonism for a number of different reasons, and they overlap to some degree. Not surprisingly, since a lot of early Christian thinkers were in fact Platonists of some sort, along with appropriating stuff from the Stoics and Aristotle and all of that. If we're talking about the 2nd to 6th, maybe even up to the 8th century, that's a characterization that you can give. Nietzsche actually has some good things, for example, in The Birth of Tragedy, to say about the church as a power structure. He kind of likes that, right? He sometimes has good stuff to say about that Jesus guy too. It's more Christians and what they've made of the doctrine. I think you could probably say the same thing about Platonism. Platonism is not the same thing as Plato, right? So, we can look at Nietzsche and say, okay, some of this is dead on. So when he is diagnosing ressentiment, look around at people who call themselves Christians today, many of whom are actually antichrists, meaning that they're opposed in their behavior and what they say and their political commitments to what the teachings of the gospel are. I mean, if you're not actually living out the Sermon on the Mount, you probably don't have any business calling yourself a Christian. So if you're not orienting yourself to, your unfortunate and vulnerable neighbors, you're not really a Christian. But you can call yourself that, and there's millions of people who do that. Nietzsche would rightly diagnose ressentiment as one of the driving forces of them, and you can just look at it and see. I mean, that's part of why they were so easy to appeal to for a candidate who is pretty anti-Christian, if you think about what Christian morality requires, right? So, yeah. All right. Vedant says Marcus Aurelius' Meditations isn't structured. What's the best way to approach the pointers, bits of advice, and mindset to adopt them into practice? Well, I've got a couple suggestions. One thing is you can, just because it doesn't have structure by itself, that doesn't mean that you as a reasonable human being, as a reader, can't provide it with some structure and say, aha, I've seen this theme before about the, contemplating the cosmos and how vast it is and how we're such a small part. That runs through a bunch of different books within it. And you can do the correlating part of that, right? You probably should as a reader. Or an article I'm working on right now has to do with his many references to providence or atoms. Doesn't matter. You can still live a good life, right? Which is spread throughout, I want to say about like 6 or 7 books, the different references there. So you can do that. Another thing that you can do is don't just read Marcus Aurelius, maybe read one of the people he was very influenced by, Epictetus. And to understand Epictetus better, maybe read Musonius Rufus as well. And if you want to understand, Stoicism and the virtues in general, well, no substitute for reading some of Seneca's letters and pieces and some of Cicero's works. And if you do that, you will understand a lot more about what Marcus is saying, and you'll start to see sort of the underlying structure of that, I would say. So I think you could do that. Mo says, as a physician, which work should I read to better my practice, particularly, increasing rapport with patients, any topics you find interesting in medical ethics? Okay, so a lot of different questions there. I don't know what you should do as a physician to improve your practice in general, but if you're trying to increase rapport with patients, you should read things that have to do with communication. And probably anything that will wean you away from thinking I'm the expert, they're just the patient, would probably be helpful. But you also need to know like how to tell when people are bullshitting you, don't you? Right? Because you get that as well, you get that in any field, right? Whether you're a physician, whether you're a car repairman, whether you're teaching philosophy, people try to bullshit you. Oh, I couldn't do my thing. Oh, I need this medication, So, those sort of things would be helpful. But I would say things that really focus a lot on understanding communication. Wouldn't hurt to know something about the emotions. Psychology existed as a discipline within philosophy long before it emerged as a separate discipline. So you can go all the way back to ancient philosophy and find very astute psychological observations. The first book that does that systematically is Aristotle's Rhetoric. Book 2 is mostly concerned with the understanding of certain human emotions, not all of them, but quite a few. Javier, have you read Wittgenstein's review of Peter Coffey's Science of Logic? Nope. Because the Wittgenstein that I read back when I was actually interested in Wittgenstein was mostly things like, the later stuff and remarks on the foundations of mathematics and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not reading reviews that Wittgenstein wrote of things. And frankly, I don't consider Wittgenstein, that great of a thinker. He's an interesting thinker. All right, let's see what else we got here. BG, what's your position on the moral realism versus anti-moral realism debate? Don't give a shit. These isms, again, super high level of abstraction, usually not engaging with actual thinkers and texts. Very boring. It's mostly people going off to their proverbial ivory tower, talking to each other, and having very little to say to any of the rest of us. So I'm not very interested in that. What's my strongest reason or argument? I don't have any, because I don't need to, because I don't actually care much about it. Hobbit, which philosophers should a person who is a minority in a country read in order to understand his situation and the role he can play for his people? I've been recommended Frantz Fanon by my teacher. There isn't any. And Fanon is writing in his own time. And if you actually read Fanon, you will see him very clearly saying that the idea that you would like read some philosopher and that would apply then to your specific situation is a great way to go astray. I mean, Fanon will have a sort of critical attitude towards Hegel, towards psychoanalysis, towards other existentialists, and say, the case of the colonized African or the person of color in the Caribbean is going to be different than, say, the master-slave dialectic, right? So I don't think there is a person that you should read primarily because you're a minority in which country. I mean, it will vary considerably. And Fanon says that. Fanon actually says the stuff that I'm saying here doesn't apply to blacks in the American South, different conditions, right? So I would be leery of that. Instead, what you could do is comparatively read people who theorized from the perspective of being a minority, and then Fanon could be helpful for you. And then plenty of African-American philosophers might be helpful for you, starting, say, with, Frederick Douglass, and thinking about what he has to say, but not trying to immediately impose it on your situation. You may find things that are useful in people who weren't minorities as well, which is quite understandable since we all do still share kind of a common human nature and thinking about stuff and all of that. Okay. So Lapse 9 Continuum has a sort of specification of the question here. People using the R word and trying to justify it. My own brother is disabled. Sometimes I feel the need to argue. Okay, well, then you've actually got a motive, right? You can say, hey, I don't appreciate you using that word. My brother is disabled, and you're targeting him by saying that. Now you've got something actually concrete. Does that mean that you have to fight every single battle? Probably not, but now you actually have, somewhat of a reason that, that makes sense. And yeah, people are, ever since Trump got reelected, people are like, yeah, it's open season. I can say anything I want now, right? And you're like, you dumbasses, you always could say what you want. It's just that you face what Jeremy Bentham calls the social sanction for acting like an asshole, and you didn't want to have to deal with that, right? So, but, I don't think that you have to argue with them. Sometimes it's enough to say, wow, I didn't know that you were gross like that. I actually think that using humor or turning disgust back on people can often be more effective than trying to make arguments. Because they're, if they're actually a troll, they're just going to use that as an excuse to troll. They're looking for engagement. I also think it's perfectly fine just to block people and say, yeah, we're not going to have a useful conversation. If somebody acts like a jerk, if they want to raise all sorts of bullshit points and you're not going to budge them, block them. There's nothing that says that you have to give them space or anything like that. Kaleidoscope says, I've been watching your channel since 2018 and I've learned a lot. Just wanted to say thank you for being a good influence in my life. Okay, so John Garrell has, that's great. I'm glad that's very helpful. John Garrell has a modification. So when you ask questions, if that's what you really have in mind, ask that question so you don't have to explain yourself. Hegel's critique of the law of identity and the law of contradiction. What do you think of that? Well, I think it's fine. We don't have to believe as dogmas that the law of identity, which, by the way, where are you getting that from? People always say Aristotle. Find me where Aristotle says the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction. You won't find it because it's not in the texts, because it's stuff that people invented later on to try to expand that to everything. I mean, you don't have to be Hegel in order to think that there could be problems with that. There's plenty of other thinkers who, see problems with that as well. So I don't see that as a particularly big problem. Unlisted logos. What early Christian thinkers do you think were Platonists that weren't deemed as a heretic by early Christians? Pretty much all of them. I mean, if you think that being a Platonist made you a heretic, somebody has really given you a line of bullshit. Because all you got to do is start reading through the church fathers, the early Christian writers, and you are going to find that they are not only interested in Platonism, which isn't just Plato, by the way, but all these other things as well, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism. They also know Aristotle. They also know the Stoics. They also know the Epicureans. They also know the Skeptics. They also even know the Cynics. They have read and thought about texts that we don't even have anymore, right? Early Christian thinkers were thinkers. They were not dummies. They read everything that was available. They some of them actually, read lots of rhetoric and medicine and music. So of course they were going to be, have some sort of philosophical perspective that incorporated what was good in the philosophies. They usually thought there was more to Platonism than there was to these others, right? The only one that they didn't really draw upon was Epicureanism. But all you got to do is read around. And I mean, you're asking what early Christian thinkers? Justin Martyr, read him, right? You'll find that he's endorsing a good bit of that. He's a Platonism to some degree, and then not to another degree. Read Evagrius Ponticus or John Cassian. They draw explicitly on the Platonist tripartite soul, as does almost everybody in the Philokalia, coming later on. Read Augustine, jumping way, way ahead. Or, if you want to skim back a bit, read Lactantius, So, these are doctors of the church. So they're at the opposite end of being heretics. Stefan, what's your opinion on Kierkegaard's book, Sickness Unto Death? Do you find it relevant in addressing despair, or is there better stuff? So a couple of different questions there. I think Sickness Unto Death is great. It's nice and short. There's cool stuff in it. I think it's, really interesting. Once you get past that brain melting first page with, the relation to the relation to the relation, which you could map out, by the way, if you wanted to. It's really a great analysis of the matter. Is it like the final word on despair? No, there's plenty of other people you can read. I mentioned Augustine already. He talks about that in various places. You could jump ahead to Gabriel Marcel. There's all sorts of thinkers, but I think it's a great book. I don't know why you want to try to find better stuff. Stick with that one for a while. Pricing. I want to ask a very basic question. What is an idea? What is a concept? How do they differ from when the Greeks used it around Socrates' time to when we use it today? The Greeks didn't use it around Socrates' time. They didn't use the term concept. Plato uses the word idea, which is basically synonymous with form. Aristotle doesn't. So I don't know. You're probably getting that from some history of philosophy textbook or site or some person who said that, but unfortunately they sold you a line of bullshit. There is no standard definition of either idea or concept. It entirely depends on which thinker you're talking about, whose epistemology you're talking about. So it's not a useful question, we could say, right? Colamus is suggesting Montaigne on experience might be interesting for a physician. Yeah, I suppose, William Zen, how can we use philosophy like virtue ethics to analyze political leaders who are authoritarian, but had a lot of positive influence, like Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore and Deng from China? Well, if you're using virtue ethics, you say, what virtues did they have? What vices did they exhibit? That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's no different for a ruler than it would be for any other person. You could also say, if what you have in mind is Aristotelian virtue ethics or Stoic virtue ethics, or, Cicero, who's kind of in between the two, you could say, what is the point of having a political community? Aristotle considers tyranny to be the worst of regimes. Would Q or Deng be tyrants from Aristotle's point of view, or from Cicero's point of view, or from a Stoic point of view? Ask yourself that. If so, well, then not very good, and probably corroding the moral status of people within that society, right? All right. Let's see here. Hughes says, do the Stoics have a list of what's required for a good life? A list? No. And actually, nobody does, and nobody should, because life is not about checklists. They have many discussions that I suppose you could take to make a list if you wanted to for yourself. But I kind of think that list making is the wrong way to go about stuff, and likely to lead you out of the actual discussions, which is where the real meat is, and into, again, very high level of abstraction that might not be that useful. Oh, here's Andy. Hey, good to see you, man. General question to see how you're doing now that the semester's finished. What's your plans for the summer? Good to see you looking healthier. Yeah, so I've got the Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues 8-week class that is starting at the end of June, which is hosted in the Study with Sadler Academy. That is part of a book project on Stoicism and the Cardinal Virtues, because if you actually want to understand what the Stoics think about that, you have to read across many texts in 2 different languages, Greek and Latin. And you have to compare and contrast on a lot of different points. The Stoics, there's no one single Stoic text to actually understand the cardinal virtues and the sub-virtues that they encompass. So that's going to be taking a good bit of my time. Video production, you can see on the blackboard, I'm shooting videos now on Augustine's Confessions that I never got to. Lots of other video and podcast project work, writing in my Substack, also doing some writing in other places. I just published a piece in the Stoa Nova about why maybe we don't need the Stoic sage, and it can be a bit of a distraction. I've got to write a piece later this weekend for the Stoic. And, there are lots of other little promised writing projects. I got an article, or rather a book chapter on Aristotle that I have to write, and, the usual like philosophical counseling and tutorials and work like that. I'm also volunteering a lot at the cat shelter. Actually, tomorrow I'm going to be going in and welcoming, and as I call it, sweetening the new arrivals. We have 10 new cats coming in tomorrow. So I go in because I can have kind of a calming presence with them and just hang out with them and, get them to be happy in their new environment. Working out, I just got enrolled in a new gym yesterday. That's about 8 blocks from where we live. So I'll be doing that, hopefully spending more time with my oldest kid, who's now living a bit closer, getting ready for my youngest kid to move up to University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she's starting in the fall studying physics and mathematics. And otherwise kind of living a life. And I will be in touch. Andy and I have a couple sort of collaborative projects that we're working on, and Andy's doing some very interesting work on grief as well. By the way, I do recommend you check out the Existential Pulse, which is another Substack that Andy writes in some great long form articles, essays, critiques, stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically what's going on. I did interestingly get asked for my availability for the fall by the chair at Marquette University. We'll see if they actually have classes for me. And one of the places that I used to teach at the in the past may be bringing me back on, but we're kind of like looking at the options for that. Chris asks, have you read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn? I don't even know who Daniel Quinn is, but that doesn't mean anything about Daniel Quinn. It just means that he's one of the tens of thousands of people out there whose works I haven't encountered. Visual Feast, what 21st century philosophers would you recommend? Oh, okay. Well, I mentioned Alistair McIntyre, who died just last month. He qualifies as 21st century since he continued being quite active. I think actually Dependent Rational Animals, so the tetralogy, After Virtue, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, Three Rival Versions, and Dependent Rational Animals. I want to say Three Rival Versions is 99 and Dependent Rational Animals is in the 21st century. So that kind of straddles that. But then he wrote other stuff. His biography of Edith Stein, a whole bunch of other great books after that. I'm more attracted to the people who are doing good work in recuperating history of philosophy. There's a lot of cool young thinkers out there doing work in areas that I am interested in, having to do with the emotions, particularly anger. You may have seen my reviews of books by Misha Cherry and Krista Tomlinson. There are people I think that are well worth checking out. I've got some great colleagues who are doing cool stuff like Christopher Gill. I mentioned Julia Anas, who's still kicking and doing good work. Nancy Sherman, great interpreter of Aristotle. Interesting takes on the Stoics as well. So, yeah. I don't read a lot of like cutting edge stuff in analytic or continental because frankly, I don't get much bang for my buck from them, All right, Kant, who do you think is a good living role model for people who want to be a philosopher? I don't know. I mean, it would really depend on what kind of philosopher you want to be. There's no such thing as philosopher as like an ideal type out there, not least because there's so many different kinds of philosophy, right? So I don't really have a good answer for that. Gayen, with the sad death of Alistair McIntyre, what do you think his legacy will be? Well, first, I don't think it's sad. I mean, the guy lived to 96 years old, right? And he was able to be very productive throughout his life. He had some, serious tragedies in his life, but he also did a lot of great stuff and had, excellent engagements with colleagues, even those he disagreed with. So I don't think it's sad when somebody who's 96 dies. As a matter of fact, I think McIntyre himself would probably agree with some of the other philosophers who have said like, yeah, you don't want to be immortal. You got to make room for the new generation. As a matter of fact, so I shot a video yesterday on this really great piece by him called Designing Our Descendants. From Before After Virtue. It was an address that he gave at the Hastings Center's general meeting in 1978. One of the things that he talks about as a virtue that we need, accepting one's death. And he says, each of us is permitted to occupy a certain space and time, a certain role in history. Without that, our lives would be emptied of significance. And he says, if I try to extend my life indefinitely, I'll become an intruder upon the next generation, right? Now, he wrote this when he was, 1978, he was probably in his 50s when he wrote that. But he's totally right, you know? So there's that part. What will his legacy be? It will lie both in his works and in his students and interlocutors. He had a lot of people who worked with him who had been influenced by him. Interestingly, the International Society for McIntyre Inquiry, McIntyre only came to that and gave an address once for his 90th birthday. He refused to. And why did he refuse to? He said, if I show up, I will be the elephant in the room. I want you to discuss, to debate, to figure things out. I don't want you turning to me as the oracle or as the arbiter or anything like that. So it's not going to be an admiration society, right? So I think that'll be part of his legacy. I've often said he was a virtue ethicist who actually walked the walk. I've written about that. I've talked about that in different places. So I think there's like thousands of stories about the guy circulating around, nearly, all of which are probably true. So that's important. Zach says, do you think knowing McIntyre deepened your appreciation of his work? I found your brief recent piece on your relationship with him quite poignant. It hasn't deepened my appreciation of his work. I was already appreciating his work. That's why I wanted to be part of that faculty seminar that got me to study with him and then to, meet with him occasionally afterwards, mostly at conferences. I will say this. So this is kind of funny. Having met the guy, right, and spent time with him, when I read his works, if there's a voice in my head as I'm reading the work, it is inevitably McIntyre's voice. So that's kind of unusual. And does that help me appreciate his work a bit better? I guess, maybe in some aesthetic way. So, all right. Did I miss something from Max earlier? Because I see Max writing 2 of 2. Let me scroll up. No, I don't see it. Okay, so Max says, where was this? 2 of 2. How do you think this would apply in the case of friendship and Stoics like Epictetus's discussion of friendship? I think I'm missing some context there, so I don't know. John Fleming, I hope you don't mind me asking, are any of your children interested in philosophy? If yes, what sort of philosophers did they like? So I don't think that they're interested in philosophy as a discipline. I don't think that they're particularly interested at this stage in this very early stage in their lives in any philosophers as philosophers per se, but they're both interested in things that intersect with philosophy. So my oldest, as many of you know, went to UW Milwaukee, originally doing musical theater, ended up switching to theater, and still works in her field after graduation here locally. Just, finished doing some stage management, does house management, writing, and directing, puppetry, acting, makeup, all these sorts of cool things, voice work as well, and is interested in, let's call them philosophical topics, primarily ethical topics, but, also very interested in Shakespeare. You get a good bit of philosophy tangentially through Shakespeare. So there's that, right? And then the other is interested in physics and mathematics. Inevitably, that's going to raise philosophical questions. We've had, discussions about the nature of infinity before. But, and I think actually we spent a little bit of time reading Cantor's finite and transfinite numbers a while back, which I'm willing to call not just mathematics, but philosophy. But neither one of them is interested in philosophy as such. And I don't see any need to, steer them in that direction. I'm happy that they both have things that they find interesting and can take some joy in. Aspire Nova, I want to study philosophy, and I picked 2 books, The History of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell, and The History of Philosophy by Grayling. Are these good for start? No. Russell's book is well written, but inaccurate in many respects. Nobody who's serious about the history of philosophy uses that as a guide. Grayling is better, but Grayling has some pretty big omissions as well. Doesn't give enough attention to a lot of philosophers who there's really no excuse for leaving out anymore. So I would say, Grayling is good, but not great. In place of Russell, you should read Cobblestone, because Cobblestone is still used as a reference in graduate departments. Cobblestone doesn't cover everything, but he's a hell of a lot more fair and accurate than Russell ever was. And he generally won't steer you wrong. He's got some gaps as well, but they're gaps that somebody in the early 20th century could be forgiven for, whereas somebody in the early 21st century, maybe not, Chris, did you read the New York Times article on McIntyre's passing? I thought they did a pretty mediocre job trying to paint a portrait of his life projects. I don't read the New York Times for 2 reasons. One is because generally the articles are not very good, and the other is it's usually behind a paywall, and I don't pay for stuff unless it's really quality, right? And the New York Times has not been quality for decades. So I don't know what they said about him. I will say this, that McIntyre himself in After Virtue mentions the New York Times in a pejorative way. So he already had it in for them. I wouldn't be surprised that they detailed somebody who doesn't really know philosophy well, or only knows a little tiny portion to do the writing, because they don't usually have the best people, Let's see. William says, any thoughts on Bishop Robert Barron and the podcast Pints with Aquinas and Matt Fraud? Well, I don't know Pints with Aquinas or Matt Fraud. Barron is a hack. I think that he is actually, and you look at the stuff that he says and the commitments that he's made, I would say he's an anti-Christian masquerading as a Christian. And long since ago, I blocked anything that he was involved with. And he's one of these people who essentially sold his soul to make political points. So yeah, it's unfortunate because he did have some talents, but he's turned them for bad ends. Aspire Nova. You're posting things a whole bunch, right? You don't have to post things more than once. Kius says, do you believe the virtues are intrinsic to our nature, meaning that they're part of our human nature? Depends on what you mean by intrinsic or part of. If you mean that they're there potentially, yes. I mean, that's basic to virtue ethics, whether it's Stoic or Platonist or Aristotelian. If you mean that they're there in us and we just have to bring them to light, no, that's complete bullshit. And that's the sort of stuff that people who do crappy virtue ethics trying to glom onto it, try to put out there, and then, inevitably live lives that are pretty scandalizing, right? So yeah, I think it takes an awful lot to cultivate virtues. And it's like a constant process. So the potentiality for it is there in human nature, and it may be there in other animal natures too. We know a lot more about animal behavior than the ancients did, or even the early moderns did. And I think we can see things that are analogous to reasoning processes, at least in certain higher animals, and perhaps things that work like sympathy or a sense of fairness. But that's a whole other topic. Isaac, as a Catholic, do you have any thoughts on this new Pope? Yeah, my thought is that Catholics should sit down and shut the hell up, and everybody else should sit down and shut the hell up and just wait and see what happens, right? I think that there's always too much armchairing going on when it comes to anybody who's in a leadership position, right? 99% of the people that have opinions on anything, having to do with the Pope are full of crap and should just be quiet. That's my opinion, or my thought. Daniel says, do you have your thoughts about Hanfetze, legalist, Baltasar Gracian? Yeah, they're interesting figures. They're not really like my cup of tea. Chinese philosophy is well worth checking out and studying. We're handicapped if we're having to read everything in translation because we're never quite sure exactly how good the translations are. Hanfetze is an interesting guy. There's lots of interesting figures throughout the history of Chinese philosophy. And a lot of those techniques, the legalist school officially died out. But plenty of the scholars of Chinese philosophy have pointed out that the Han Dynasty was not as Confucius as it pretended to be. They certainly used a lot of the ideas that the legalists had put forward. Gracian, we get all those aphorisms. They're interesting. I might down the line. I was like rereading him recently because I had a student who was interested in him a while back, and I was like, yeah, I should go back to that. But that's the best I can say is interesting. Are they really? Are they what you should be? If your goal is to get the most bang for your buck in terms of your scarce time for study, is that what I would be steering somebody towards? Probably not, But if you're really into Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu's work, talk about a wax nose you can bend any way you want, right? But if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, yeah, I guess that could be good. Rusty says, famous work on virtue ethics or one that's underappreciated in your opinion? I don't have a favorite work. I don't have a lot of favorites in a lot of things. On virtue ethics, we could talk about works in virtue ethics that are articulating a substantive virtue ethics, and then we can talk about works where people are providing kind of an overview of virtue ethics, which tends to be a bit more abstract. I can't say I have a favorite. Books that are underappreciated. Well, Cicero's On Duties, definitely. Pretty much all of Plutarch's works. Hardly anybody reads him, but he's got lots of great stuff having to do with virtue ethics. There's a lot of really interesting medieval stuff that hardly anybody reads, like Alcuin's On Virtues and Vices, because people mostly, when they talk about virtue ethics, they typically think about Aristotle, and then they think about this bullshit of the revival of virtue ethics in the 20th century, which is only a revival of virtue ethics in the Anglosphere and only in certain parts of it, mostly associated with like Oxford and Cambridge, because plenty of people were doing virtue ethics all the way down to the present, like Yves Simon, for example. He's got a wonderful book on virtue. That was, I think from the 50s or something like that, long before this so-called revival. Somebody who I would say is kind of cool to check out is Robert Audi, who's known more for being an intuitionist, or as he calls it, a pluralist, but he's got some good little articles on virtue ethics that I often have people read. So, and actually, I'm going to jump to Unlisted Logos's question because I do want to say something about this. What are your thoughts of virtue ethics in contrast to deontological ethics and consequentialism? All of that is bullshit. There is no such thing as consequentialism. There is no such thing as deontological ethics, and there is no such thing as virtue ethics. Those are all high-level abstractions, and you will not do yourself much good focusing on that. If you want to know about deontology, you actually read Kant, and you read other people, not just Kant, who have ethics that focus on duty. So you read Schopenhauer, right? Because he also talks about duty. And you also read the intuitionists, like I just mentioned, Robert Audi and W.D. Ross. And you read divine command ethics and other people. And after you've done enough of that, now you can actually talk about deontology. But until you've done that, you don't know enough about this deontology to say anything or think much about it. Consequentialism, even bigger. That includes egoism, which has a whole bunch of different things. That includes utilitarianism, which is a vast tradition and has precursors going all the way back in Western philosophy. Well, you can find some utilitarian lines of reasoning even in some ancient philosophy, and you can find it in Mozi, right, in Chinese philosophy. So there is no such thing as any of these. And when it comes to virtue ethics, you got to be reading actual virtue ethics, or you don't have virtue ethics. So you got to be reading Aristotle or Aristotelians or the Stoics or the Epicureans. They had a virtue ethics, right? Or the Platonist tradition, or these, great Christian thinkers that absorbed these and developed it. But there's no such thing as virtue ethics per se, except in textbooks where it lives as an abstraction. So you can't even compare them in this way, right? You're be kind of wasting your time. All right. Aspire Nova says, I'm from India. Do you think schools should either teach all major religions and atheism equally or remove religion entirely from the curriculum? You can't remove religion entirely from a curriculum and actually teach history or social studies, because you would lose a lot of what you're talking about. You probably can't even teach English classes if there's literature that includes religious references. So that's a non-starter, right? Maybe what you mean is there shouldn't be advocacy, right? It's certainly possible to teach about religions from a sort of neutral perspective. We do it all the time in world religions classes. I've been teaching that since 2002 in various places. Actually, no, before that. No, it was 2002. That was one of the first classes that I taught at Southeastern Illinois College before I finished graduate school. And yeah, we probably, there's an argument to be made for teaching about religions so that we can cultivate religious literacy. And it doesn't matter whether you're in India or the United States or Germany or Brazil. The same logic would hold. If you want to actually understand the world, and there are many human beings in the world who are religious or have been, you probably need to know something about their points of view, and not from a committed, we're going to teach this as Christians or we're going to teach this as Hindus, but just a sort of religious studies perspective. John Flemings, have you read the book What is Called Thinking by Heidegger? I have. Do you think it's a good introduction to his work? No, I would say if you want a good introduction to his work, you could start where I always start students, and that's with what is metaphysics. I think that's probably the best place to start. And that's why I produced resources on it that you can easily find out there. Probably should do some writing about it. But, I think it's enough to do video and podcast resources at this point in time. QS says, would it be a worthy pursuit to develop and define exactly the faculties under our control? Thus, everything else would be considered out of our control. No. Why would you think that you should reinvent wheels that other people have already done? If you're attracted to this inside outside your control, which by the way is not what Epictetus talks about. He talks about up to us, not up to us. By the way, where did that concept first emerge? Aristotle. not in the Stoics, right? It's already there in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3. Do you need to define exactly? No, you don't need to do that. As a matter of fact, that might be a distraction. So I don't think that's probably a great way to go about things. Arcturus, do single words have a meaning in themselves, or are we always understanding them in relation to an implicit structure context? Both, you know? Why would it have to be either or in that case? Let's see here. Kant, any thoughts on Peter Kreeft and Thomas Sowell? One of them is a decent writer and probably a decent thinker. The other one is kind of a hack. And you can really tell a lot about people by who they love to quote. If somebody's quoting Kreeft, I'll be like, well, let me check the context. They might be a right-wing nutter because Kreeft is popular among them. But they might actually be a decent person. If they're quoting Sowell, I'm like, well, I know exactly what kind of person I'm dealing with here. They like his bullshit, Howell's a sack, or Sowell's Sowell is a hack. I was doing a spoonerism there. Let's see here. Sunny Blue, I'm interested in early philosophical reflections on aesthetics, especially those addressing symmetry, proportion, harmony, and the qualitative foundations of beauty. Well, then you are in luck, because you can start with Plato and what the little things we have of Pythagoras. We don't have much, right? So when people say, oh, Pythagoras taught this or that, that's usually coming from texts that are written many centuries after Pythagoras died, which may be reflective of what he taught or may not. There was like a continual Pythagorean school, but we don't really know that much. But Plato, there's stuff there. Aristotle, the bits of things that we still have from Aristoxenus, who wrote about music, student of Aristotle, who didn't like Aristotle much. Continuing on, we have people writing about those sorts of things all the way up into the Middle Ages. So lots and lots of thinkers that you can poke around in. Augustine, you're going to see him referencing those sorts of things quite a lot in his various works, but you can find it in earlier thinkers as well. So yeah. Santiago, this is a difficult topic. I'd like to know what you think about assisted suicide, as well as the possibility of cases with people with mental illness who don't respond to treatment. Well, I don't think that just because somebody has a mental illness and doesn't respond to treatment, then you should kill them. Unless we're in like incredibly crazy crisis times, right? That you could say that if there was a triage going on, like there's a terrible earthquake and you got to save some people and you can't save others, that maybe the person with incurable mental illness might get a lower priority than other people, but that's just one of many other factors, right? Assisted suicide, I don't have that much of a beef with it myself, in part because there's cases where, a person is really deeply suffering and it doesn't seem like the suffering is accomplishing much. I know there's people who are like, the Lord sees all the suffering and appreciates it, but I don't know. I think a merciful Lord at a certain point would be like, you had enough, buddy. Go ahead. That said, should it be used for like people who are suffering from depression and they're like, yeah, the world sucks? Probably not, right? I think it would be in cases of like terrible medical maladies. I don't think it should be used just as a way to get out of a sucky life. William Zen, who do you think are the most interesting saints of the last century? I don't pay much attention to saints, frankly, so that's not a thing that I'm super into. I got the saints that I particularly like, occasionally think about, read, pray to, but I don't worry about the others too much, Unlisted Logos, any advice on writing papers for an undergrad philosophy conference? Yeah, actually, I do. So, one bit of advice would be, it is an undergrad philosophy conference. You don't need to place on your shoulders a perfectionist burden that what you're doing has to be amazing or great. It's an undergrad paper, right? So there's room for improvement. You don't have to like cover every single potential counter objection, or have footnotes on all the relevant literature. You don't even have to do that at a graduate student conference, or even a conference just for established academics. And I would say it's, as far as like presenting goes, so there's a couple things. One is, if you're not used to presenting, 99% chance you're going to start talking faster than you should. So, and I see this sometimes happening. And, if I can, I'll actually give the person like a sign, come on, slow down, or I'll say a little prayer for them sometimes. If you're talking fast, it's usually because of, nervousness, which is totally understandable, because you're presenting stuff to your peers and people that are further along than you, and you want to like come across well. If you talk fast, it'll be harder for your audience to understand. And the goal is for them to actually understand what you're saying and presenting, so that you can have a good Q&A session afterwards. That's another reason why you don't have to have everything figured out. Leave some openings where people can ask questions. Well, why did you say this? Or is there really a good, argument for this, right? Then you can actually have a conversation. I think it's probably good for the people that you're presenting to, and maybe even for yourself, to make a handout, just like a one-page handout about your presentation, kind of outlining it. If you're like appealing to texts, maybe put passages from those texts in there. If you would normally be using like a diagram, like maybe you're going to use slides, you could put those in a simplified way in your handout. And make sure to put your contact information in the handout, because if somebody sees you're at a conference, and they go to your thing and they're like, oh yeah, I wanted to talk to that person afterwards, then they don't have to like try to find the conference schedule and your contact information. They've got it there on the handout. So I think that can be quite useful as well. Sunny Blue has two questions about Sadler's Academy stuff. I missed the Sadler Academy Saturday sessions on the Platonic dialogues. Such a rare opportunity. Would you consider running them again, or offering recordings or notes for purchase? Well, I won't offer recordings because, those are recordings of the sessions that I had with the people, and their faces are on the thing because we did gallery view. And so I don't have permission to give them to people outside of the class. But I'm going to run the class again. I mean, I run some of these classes over and over again. I'll be teaching Aristotle on the moral virtues later on in the fall. That'll be the fourth time I've taught that class through the Study with Sadler Academy. I'm teaching an expanded version of Stoicism on the cardinal virtues. I taught it before as a 6-week. Now it's an 8-week class because we really need those weeks. So that's a repeat as well. I'll definitely be doing Plato's dialogues again. I may actually offer another class on Plato's dialogues. So we did the Ion, Meno, Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, Phaedo. Andy, by the way, was in that class, who I mentioned earlier. And I might do one later on that would be on other dialogues like the Protagoras and the Gorgias and stuff like that. I will also be doing a Saturday seminar on Plato's Symposium sometime in the fall. So plenty of Plato coming up. The online discussion about Nietzsche's genealogy of morals went pretty good, I would say. That was challenging getting all that in one day. Would I do it on the will to power? Yeah, maybe down the line. The next Nietzsche text that I want to offer a class on is actually the Birth of Tragedy. So the earliest of the works, not the latest of the works. Charlie says, I'm working on a project about ideology, American fiction, and postmodernism. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on Jameson's view of ideology as the representation of the subject's imaginary relationship to his or her real conditions of existence, trying to get a grasp on the varying conceptions of ideology. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on Jameson's idea. I mean, I think it's one of many different ways of defining ideology. Like most definitions, it really doesn't work well as a catchphrase. You have to like unpack it within the scope of Jameson's ideas. So you got to know what Jameson means by imaginary relationship and real conditions of existence. Fortunately, Jameson is a Marxist, so he thinks real conditions of existence is the social fabric in which we live, which includes economic relationships and all of those sorts of things. So Hughes says, do you have any opinions on Alan Watt? Yeah, overrated. He was cool as an intro for helping people to get interested in stuff. I don't think he's a particularly great thinker to go to for ideas about stuff, unless you want to do like new age hippy dippy stuff. You know, he's a big popular guy. He'll never go out of style, because there's always people wanting to get into his work, I guess. Aspire Nova. I had a thought. If a poor man suffers in this life and doesn't have time to pray and ends up in hell, while a rich man prays and ends up in heaven, isn't that double injustice? What do you think? I think that cases like that are so removed from reality that they're a waste of our time, basically. When is it ever going to be the case that a poor man never has any time to pray? I mean, you can pray while you're working, right? You can pray while you're dying. So it's kind of a non-starter, right? Colomus, how should we pay attention? How much should we pay attention to what others notice about us and our relationships? For example, if someone is in a relationship that they don't realize is bad and someone points that out, in that case, it seems right to do so, but those observations aren't always accurate or even charitable. Okay, so those are some good points. So let's start with the last part, right? You can make observations, and let's make it more concrete. You've got a friend, you're in the same college classes together, maybe you were in the same dorm, and they get involved with somebody and they're not good for them, right? And you're like, yeah, you're not as happy as you used to be. You seem more anxious. You're worried about what this other person thinks or says, or, rules that they're imposing on you. Now, it could be that you're wrong, right? It could be that you're misjudging the situation. So, how can you figure that out? Ask somebody else. Hey, do you notice what's going on with Brad over there? Ever since he's been hanging out with Tony, something seems to be off, and you see if you can get some confirmation. You also can bring it up, as you point out, in a charitable or uncharitable way. You could be like, hey, idiot, your jackass friend over there is screwing you up. That's probably not very charitable. So, you could also say, hey, I wanted to talk with you because I'm concerned about you, man. And I noticed there's a change in your affect recently, and I'm getting worried about, whether this person's having a bad effect on you, right? I think that would be just fine. And is it right to do so? Yeah. I mean, don't expect that they will necessarily respond positively to you. You don't have a right to that. But it is a good thing to point out to people if they're going astray, especially if they're close to you, as opposed to a complete stranger. If you see some complete stranger, so like, let's say you see people arguing in public and you don't know either one of them and they're being mean to each other. You don't have to go up to them and be like, this is not the way a relationship should go. That's probably not going to be helpful, Let's see here. Laerda is the Ecclesiastes quote in John Baudrillard's Simulacra and the simulation, lie, farce, simulacrum. I don't know. Haven't read it for a long time. Sunny Blue, how does one become a member to your channel? I understand you have a Patreon. Does your YouTube channel have a specific membership? Yeah, I got memberships in my YouTube channel. I got Patreon, two totally separate things. I also have a Substack, and people are paid subscribers of that. And each one, you go to the channel, and there's something you click about membership, and it'll tell you all about it. Same thing with the Patreon or any of those other things. I think it's pretty straightforward. Kyriakos, very practical question. What are some realistic, decently paying jobs, career paths a recent philosophy graduate can go to? Well, there's no like philosophy factory where you're cranking out philosophy widgets. It depends on what you studied and what sort of skills you have and what you've done. I mean, with a philosophy degree, you can, if you're good at like making a case for yourself, you can say, hey, I've learned how to analyze things critically and do research. And I know something about behaving ethically that maybe some other people don't really have as much background in. But there's really no philosophy to X pipeline that you're going to find out there. You got to be able to make a case for why what you've been studying is relevant. And, you might want to start researching some of the literature out there about philosophy and as a field and critical thinking and problem solving, and look at what employers say that they're looking for. I mean, way back in the past, a lot of people in philosophy went into like systems analysis. That was in the 80s and 90s. I think there's a lot of other things that people might be suited for, but you might also find, depending on what kind of philosophy you've been studying, that it doesn't turn out to have a hell of a lot of relevance to what it is that they want you to do in a job, right? So if you've been mostly doing analytic philosophy, it's tough to figure out what you're going to sell. I mean, even if like you've been doing a lot of stuff on ethics, you're not going to step right into a hospital as an ethicist consultant job. They're going to want grad school for that. We actually had somebody who did that from my alma mater. She specialized in medical ethics, and that was her thing. So I don't know. I don't know that there's a lot of decent paying jobs that philosophy is the best pipeline for. So, all right. I don't see any further questions. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so I'll give it another couple minutes. If we have any further ones, I'll answer those. Otherwise, I'll mention again, we've got this cool class on Stoicism and the cardinal virtues coming up at the end of the month. Link to it down below in the video description. At least in the YouTube one. I don't think I put it in there for Facebook and LinkedIn. What else do we got? Worlds of Speculative Fiction. I'm doing the Bulgarian next Saturday, books 1 through 3 of that. That has been a real treat. We got a really cool classic metal class coming up later this month with me and Scott Trulli talking about Canadian metal. Laps 9 Continuum says, I wanted to say I've been watching your stuff since 2015 at least. You've been a force for good in the world from where I sit. Good luck with the Stoic class. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I've done some bad stuff and given a bad example to some people at some point down the line, but hopefully I do more good than bad, right? Unlisted logos. Should I do a philosophy of mind class next semester or philosophy of religion? I don't know. I mean, do you know anything about the professors? Where do your interests lie? Maybe, it's not like you could say one is better than the other right off the bat. You probably need to consider factors, maybe even like down to your schedule. Like if you're a morning person or you're not a morning person and they schedule philosophy of religion at 8:00 in the morning, might not be that good of a class for you, right? Robert Leroy, any philosophy books you find offer helpful advice about navigating interpersonal relationships? Yeah, I mean, they start with Plato. I mean, figuring out what actually motivates you and, what a good relationship looks like. It's discussed in some of his dialogues. There in Aristotle, he's got, 2 books devoted to what he calls friendship, which covers a huge gamut in the Nicomachean Ethics. And, Cicero has an entire book called On Friendship. Plutarch has all sorts of interesting works about relationships, not just friendships, but spousal relationships, brothers and sisters and things like that. So I would say, you could begin in ancient philosophy and move forward. You'll find all sorts of interesting discussions. Sometimes you got to get a little off the beaten track, right? So, for example, Rene Descartes, you probably know him mostly for the Meditations or the Discourse, but he had this great correspondence with Princess Elizabeth. And, that inspired him to write a book on the passions of the soul, which is psychology, which could really help you figure some things out for yourself. So, all right. Well, thanks to everybody for your questions and comments and for hanging out on a Saturday, for me, afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. It might be evening, it might be morning. I will, see you perhaps in some other events down the line. And a couple other questions coming up. I'll take these real quick. What do I think about people debating fictional character fights? It's probably useless. Seems like a good intro to arguing, reasoning for many. I mean, it could be a good intro. Don't stay there, right? And then Aspire Nova posts 3 times. Again, you don't have to post more than once. I don't know why you're posting multiple times. Now 4 times. If rituals don't help in urgent moments, what's their real value? If God doesn't act in time, can shrines or sacred oils do more? Is this faith or just tradition? A lot of this is stuff you don't have any knowledge of. How do you know whether they help or not? Do you have a comprehensive grasp over the workings of the universe? These kind of ifs are very, very abstract ifs that I don't see how these sorts of questions help you out with anything. All right, so we'll end there, and I will see all of you hopefully somewhere else down the line. And hope you have a great rest of the day and the week.